When people think about medieval armies marching to battle, they picture the thing that made them famous. The pennons, snapping above lance tips, the hauberk glinting at first light, the siege engines dragged across frozen ground toward walls that cost more than cities to build. They picture Chateau Gaillard rising above the Seine at Les Andelys, the fortress Richard III of England, completed by 1198, documented by historian John Gillingham in Richard de Marx, published by Yale University Press in 1999. So deliberately engineered that Richard reportedly claimed it could hold against all of France even if its curtain walls were made of butter. But the armies camped in the river valleys below those walls, filling leather flasks from every stream and standing puddle on the march, or dying of something that no sword could stop. Not the enemy, not the cold, not the wound that opened in a skirmish outside the gate. The water. And the commanders whose armies arrived at the wall still fighting were not the ones with the cleanest rivers. They were the ones who had solved it with a piece of metal that cost less than a single bolt at any hardware store. $2, one copper fitting. A technique the physics behind which has not changed by a single variable since the 12th century. No filter, no chemical, no infrastructure, no invoice, copper. The bottled water industry in the United States alone generated $24.3 billion in revenue in 2021, according to the Beverage Marketing Corporation's annual report. The global market topped $270 billion the same year, according to Grand View Research's 2022 market analysis. Every dollar of that number exists because at some point the idea that water could be made bacterially safe at zero cost, in a vessel, over hours without a treatment plant or supply chain, became commercially inconvenient for the people who needed to build an industry around thirst. The Crusader garrison at Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, the fortress that withstood every military assault from its capture by Count Raymond II of Tripoli in 1142 until the Mamluk siege of 1271, documented in historian Hugh Kennedy's Crusader Castles, published by Cambridge University Press in 1994, did not have a treatment contract or a filter subscription. The cisterns built into the lower ward of that castle are still intact. The stone is still there. The channels that fed water into those cisterns are still visible to anyone willing to walk the site today. The physics keeping water in those cisterns bacterially manageable has been operating continuously in that stone since the 12th century, whether anyone is paying attention or not. Those cisterns cannot be invoiced. The copper fittings on the water channels at Fountains Abbey in North Yorkshire, whose water infrastructure was excavated and documented by Glyn Coppack and Abbeys and Priories, published by English Heritage in 1990, did not stop working when the last Cistercian monk was expelled in 1539. The metal did not receive a cancellation notice. The physics was not decommissioned. It continued. Medieval kingdoms stress-tested their solutions in conditions that modern testing laboratories cannot simulate: famine, siege, a winter that killed the supply lines while the enemy controlled the river. If the water solution failed, it did not fail quietly. It failed through the bodies of hundreds of soldiers in a matter of weeks, as Fulcher of Chartres documented firsthand in his Historia Hierosolymitana, an eyewitness chronicle written in the early 12th century, describing the devastating illness that swept through Crusader forces camped outside Antioch in 1097 and 1098, killing more men than the Turkish garrison defending the city walls. Not struggled, died. The techniques that survived that caliber of stress test are still physically present in structures you can visit. The cisterns at Crac des Chevaliers, the water channels at Fountains Abbey, the stone-lined wells at Caernarfon Castle, whose construction records from the 1280s survive in the accounts of Master James of St. George, documented by historian Arnold Taylor in the Welsh Castles of Edward Limart, published by Hambledon Press in 1986. These are not museum exhibits behind glass. They are active evidence, physics that no one has managed to invalidate in 800 years. They did not survive because someone preserved them. They survived because the physics does not expire. And the reason you are paying $100 a year, the American Water Works Association's 2021 estimate of average household spending on bottled and filtered water, is not because the modern solution is superior. It is because the stone cisterns at Crac des Chevaliers cannot be subscribed to. The copper channel at Fountains Abbey cannot be billed on a quarterly cycle. Intact medieval water infrastructure cannot be invoiced. This is not a new idea. Ibn Sina, the Persian physician known in the West as Avicenna, specified in his Canon of Medicine, Al-Qanun fi al-Tib, completed around 1025 CE, and used as the primary medical teaching text at the University of Bologna and the University of Montpellier, from the 12th through the 17th century, according to historian Nancy Ciraci in Medieval and Early Renaissance Medicine, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1990, that water intended for drinking and extended storage should be held in vessels of copper or silver, because those metals act on the water in a way no other vessel material replicates. He was not speculating. He was codifying centuries of observed practice into the most widely read medical reference in the medieval world. Al-Razi, The Baghdad-based physician known in Europe as Rhazes, who died in 925 CE, had already documented the relationship between vessel material and water safety in his encyclopedic Kitab al-Hawi, a medical compendium so comprehensive that it ran to 23 volumes in its complete form, noted by historian Manfred Ullmann in Islamic Medicine, published by Edinburgh University Press in 1978. He observed that metal vessels did not merely contain water. They changed its quality over time in ways that clay and wood did not. And the Byzantine military manual known as the Strategikon, attributed to Emperor Maurice and dated to approximately 600 CE by historian George Dennis in his 1984 translation published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, set standards for Army water supply that specified metal containers as preferable to wood or treated animal skin for water stored more than a single day's march from its source. Not because metal was more available. Wood was cheaper and lighter. Metal was specified because the commanders who wrote the manual had watched what happened to armies that didn't use it. Then one industry made the permanent solution inconvenient. Not wrong. Inconvenient. In 1908, Jersey City, New Jersey became the first American municipality to implement continuous chlorination of a public water supply, a process whose commercial scale development was driven in large part by the industrial chemical sector, which had developed surplus chlorine capacity as a byproduct of electrolytic processes used in other manufacturing. The knowledge that Cistercian monasteries like Fountains Abbey had maintained across 4 unbroken centuries, passed from master mason to lay brother, recorded in the construction accounts that survive in the Yorkshire Archaeological Register and the archives of the British Library, became worth less than a utility payment that arrives on a billing cycle without being asked for. You cannot sell a subscription to a copper jug. You can sell one to a municipal treatment contract renewed every fiscal year by people who have forgotten there was ever another option. That is the complete explanation. Nothing was banned. Nothing was hidden. The billing cycle simply didn't have room for free. At the height of medieval England's castle-building period, the country had over 1,500 functioning fortifications, documented by historian Robert Lydiard in Castles in Context, published by Windgather Press in 2005. Every single one of them solved the water contamination problem without paying anyone, without a bill, without a supplier, without a service contract that required annual renewal. The average American household today spends approximately $1,200 per year on bottled water and point-of-use filtration combined, according to the American Waterworks Association's 2021 consumer research. Medieval castle engineers paid zero. The antimicrobial property of copper, named the oligodynamic effect by Swiss botanist Carl Wilhelm von Nageli in his 1893 paper submitted to the Proceedings of the Zurich Natural History Society, has not changed by a single variable since the 12th century. It is physically present in the copper plumbing inside your walls right now, and almost nobody is using it. You've seen this your whole life and just never connected the dots. A copper penny left in the bottom of a garden flower vase keeps the water from going green for weeks. You may have done this. You may have been told it was an old trick without being told why it worked. The penny is not filtering anything. The copper is releasing ions into the water. Those ions disrupt the cellular membranes of the bacteria that cause the green. That is the physics. That is what Avicenna described in 1025. The penny in the vase is a 1,000-year-old water treatment system, sitting in a living room and being called a garden tip. The blue-green patina forming on an old copper roof, on a copper pipe fitting pulled from a wall during renovation, on the base of a copper mixing bowl left too long in a damp cabinet. That is verdigris, copper carbonate, and copper hydroxide, the visible residue of copper ions moving into the immediate environment. That color is the evidence that the process is running. Every old copper fixture you have ever walked past and assumed was just aging was demonstrating the oligodynamic effect in real time. A professional baker who has worked with both copper and plastic mixing bowls will tell you the copper bowl stays cleaner between uses in a way that is difficult to explain by scrubbing alone. The bowl is not being maintained differently. The surface is actively inhibiting what tries to grow on it. Medieval kitchens and documented castle inventories, including the household accounts of Kenilworth Castle under Simon de Montfort in the 1260s, referenced by historian David Carpenter in The Struggle for Mastery, published by Oxford University Press in 2003, listed copper vessels specifically alongside iron and ceramic. And copper appears consistently in the categories associated with food and water storage rather than cooking over a direct flame. The medieval technique is not somewhere inaccessible. It is in the patina on every copper object you have walked past your entire life. The physics was always there. You were simply never told that it was something you could use on purpose. Here's what you need. I want to be honest with you about every number. 1/2-inch copper pipe cap. Available in the plumbing aisle at any Home Depot, Lowe's, or independent hardware store. The price runs between $0.89 and $1.40, depending on brand and location. You may already own one from a previous project. sitting in a jar somewhere in a utility room. If you do, the cost of the system is zero. The copper cap must be marked or sold as standard plumbing grade copper, type K, type L, or type M in North American standards, which correspond to a minimum copper content of 99.9% per ASTM B88 specification. Decorative copper-colored fittings, sold for craft or aesthetic use, are often copper-plated zinc or steel, and they will not produce the same ion concentration. The piece costs more than a decorative alternative, but it works. The decorative alternative does not. One clean storage container. Glass, glazed ceramic, or food-grade stainless steel, not plastic. The point is a non-porous surface that does not harbor bacteria and microscopic surface irregularities the way most plastics do once they develop the small scratches that begin within weeks of use. A 2-liter glass pitcher from any discount kitchen supplier runs between $6 and $8 and lasts indefinitely without degrading. If you already own a glass pitcher, a ceramic crock, or a wide-mouth glass jar, the only cost is the copper fitting. That's genuinely it. Here is the one thing most people get wrong when they try to replicate what medieval garrison commanders and monastic engineers built. They think the copper is a filter. It is not. And the armies that died from waterborne illness during the Crusades did not die because they lacked metal. The commanders who lost soldiers by the hundreds at the siege of Antioch in 1097, documented by Fulcher of Chartres in a chronicle he wrote as an eyewitness, were not operating without copper vessels. They were moving copper across a continent in the form of cooking pots, weapon fittings, and personal items. The failure was not the absence of the material. It was one specific misunderstanding about how the material works. Every commander who lost an army to dysentery used the same copper, the same iron, the same wood as the commanders whose armies remained functional. The material was never the variable. The variable was continuous surface contact between the copper and the water over time. A copper piece dropped into a wooden barrel that the water also shared with a wooden ladle, a leather strap, and sediment from the river bottom provides a fraction of the ionic exposure of a vessel, where every surface the water touches is metal. Avicenna's canon of medicine is explicit on this point. The vessel itself must be copper or silver, not merely copper adjacent. The water needs to be enclosed within the metal, not merely near it. That specific instruction, the vessel, not just a piece in the vessel, is documented as the distinction between effective and ineffective practice in the Latin translation of the canon used at Bologna, noted in Nancy Ceresi's examination of medieval medical curricula. The garrison at Crac des Chevaliers understood this. Their cisterns were fed by stone channels lined with copper alloy fittings, documented in Hugh Kennedy's architectural analysis of the site, meaning every drop of water entering storage had already traveled along a copper surface before it settled. The contact was total. The result was a water supply functional enough to sustain a garrison through the longest sustained sieges in Crusader history. Build the way the commanders at Antioch built it, metal somewhere in the system. And you get what those armies got. Build the way the garrison at Crac des Chevaliers built it, metal as the contact surface for the stored water. And you get a supply that outlasted every force sent to shut it down. Step 1. Clean the copper piece immediately before each use. Not with dish soap. Soap leaves a surfactant residue in the microscopic pores of the metal surface that slows ion transfer. Use half a lemon or a tablespoon of white vinegar on a clean cloth and rub the exterior and interior of the copper cap until the surface is uniformly bright orange-pink, without dark patches or a dull gray film. That dark film is copper oxide, which forms on copper exposed to air. It is not harmful, but it acts as an insulating layer between the active copper beneath and the water above it. Removing it takes 30 to 45 seconds. The surface will be slightly warm from friction when you're done. That surface is now active. Do this before every fresh batch of water, not just the first use. Step 2. Place the clean copper cap at the bottom of the glass or ceramic container before adding water. Convex side down, open end up, so that the maximum external surface area is in contact with the floor of the vessel, and the maximum internal surface area faces upward into the water column. Think of it the way a tea bag releases its content from the center of the water outward. The copper cap positioned at the base means the ion gradient rises through the full depth of the water above it, not just spreads laterally from one side. Step 3. Pour water in, slowly enough that you can observe its clarity as it fills. Not because the speed affects the chemistry, it does not, but because the copper technique addresses bacterial contamination, not silt, mineral turbidity, or chemical contamination. If the water pours cloudy or carries visible particles, settle it first or filter it through cloth before it goes into the copper vessel. What you're putting the copper to work on should already be visually clear water from a clean source. The copper addresses what you cannot see. Do not ask it to also address what you can. Step 4. Cover the container with a clean cloth tied at the neck or loose lid that allows air exchange without allowing insects or dust. Sealed airtight storage reduces the small amount of dissolved oxygen exchange that the ionic process benefits from. The Cistercian monks at Reval Abbey covered their water storage with linen cloth held by cord, documented in the abbey's late 12th century customary, the daily rule of operations, a practice that appears consistently across monastic water management records of the period. Step 5. Set the container in the coolest, darkest available location. A stone floor, a cellar shelf, a cabinet well away from the stove or any heat source. The optimal temperature for the technique is the same temperature medieval stone cellars and below-ground storage rooms naturally maintained, between 12 and 18 degrees Celsius. Below 10, bacterial growth has already slowed to the point where the copper's contribution is marginal. Above 25, certain bacterial strains multiply faster than the copper ions can suppress them. The cellar environment that medieval builders created deliberately for food and water storage was not aesthetic. It was the controlled chamber the chemistry required. Step 6. Wait. The minimum effective contact time documented in a 2009 study by Suda and colleagues published in the Journal of Water Health was 8 hours for significant bacterial reduction in surface contaminated water. At 24 hours, the same study documented a 99% reduction in total coliform bacteria in water stored in copper vessels at room temperature. The Benedictine schedule, structured in the Rule of St. Benedict, written in 516 CE, and adopted as the operational standard of nearly every Western European monastery by the 9th century, drew water for the following day at Compline, the final prayer service of the night, and used it beginning at prime the following morning. That interval is approximately 12 to 14 hours. Whether the monks understood the ionic mechanism or simply observed that this schedule produced reliably safe water, the operational result was the same. Fill the vessel the evening before you need it. Step 7. The test. Lift the copper piece out after 24 hours. If the surface has developed a faint greenish or bluish-green tinge, the first stage of verdigris formation, the ion transfer is active and the piece is working. If the surface looks unchanged from when you placed it in, either the oxide layer reformed too quickly due to high mineral content in the water, or the fitting is not genuine plumbing-grade copper, replace it with a fitting explicitly labeled type K or type L and repeat. The tinge test requires no instruments, no strips, no equipment. A hand and an eye are sufficient. Medieval practitioners had exactly those, and the technique worked at Crac des Chevaliers for a century. Run the math from 1 unit outward. 1 copper cap, $2.04, 1 2-liter glass pitcher, $7 Total system cost, $8.40. Recurring cost from day 2 forward, 0. A family of 4 requires approximately 8 liters of drinking water per day for direct consumption according to the World Health Organization's baseline figure of 2 liters per person per day for drinking water in temperate climates. 2 fills of a 2-liter pitcher per person, each filled the evening before and ready the following morning. The copper pieces rinsed, the surface wiped with a lemon or vinegar cloth, placed back in the cleaned pitcher and refilled. 4 pitchers cycling through a 24-hour interval supply the household with no infrastructure beyond a shelf in a cool room. Annual cost, $8.40 once. Not once per year. Once. Scale to a community. Reval Abbey in North Yorkshire, founded in 1132, housed between 140 and 150 monks and lay brothers at its 12th century peak, according to historian David Knowles in the Monastic Order in England, published by Cambridge University Press in its 2nd edition in 1963. That is a residential community larger than many modern rural villages. The Cistercians at Reval supplied that population from a single engineered water system. Stone channels, copper alloy fittings, gravity-fed cisterns, documented in the English Heritage Survey of the site, referenced by Glyn Kopak. The infrastructure investment was labor and materials at construction. The ongoing cost was maintenance of the channels and the replacement of worn fittings. There was no treatment expenditure because the treatment was built into the contact surface of the infrastructure itself. A modern rural community of 150 people relying on individual filtered or bottled water purchases spends approximately $180,000 per year at the American Waterworks Association's household average, scaled across 50 households. Revo's solution, at the scale Revo operated it, cost that figure once, at construction in the 12th century, and then ran without recurring expense for 400 years until the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII in 1539. No bills, no infrastructure dependency, no asking anyone's permission. One honest limitation. Copper's oligodynamic effect addresses gram-negative bacteria, E. coli coliform strains, Salmonella typhi, and the organisms responsible for the majority of common waterborne gastrointestinal illness in surface water and shallow wells. It has a measurable but significantly reduced effect on gram-positive bacteria, limited effect on protozoa, including Giardia lamblia and Cryptosporidium, and essentially no effect on viral contamination or chemical and heavy metal contamination. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine specifies this boundary in practical terms, noting that copper and silver vessel storage is recommended for water drawn from clean, visually clear sources, not as a remedy for visibly contaminated or chemically compromised water. The recommendation is to begin with the best available source and use the vessel treatment to suppress the microbial load introduced during handling and storage, not to use the treatment as a substitute for source quality judgment. This boundary was understood by the practitioners who developed the technique over centuries of operational use. It is not a flaw discovered recently. It is the documented scope of the application. If your water source is in an area with documented agricultural chemical runoff, industrial contamination, or geological heavy metal content, this technique is not your primary solution. It is one layer of a system. In its correct application, clean source water, bacterial contamination risk from handling and storage, it is a permanent, zero-cost, and completely functional answer. Chateau Gaillard still stands above the Seine at Les Andelys in Normandy. Richard the Fir's walls, built before 1198, are still there. The chevrons carved into the outer curtain, the rounded towers that represented the most current military engineering thinking of the late 12th century. The cisterns that supplied the garrison during Philip II's siege in the winter of 1203, documented by chronicler Guillaume le Breton in his Philippide, written in the early 13th century as a first-hand account of the French campaign, are still visible in the stonework. The physics that made the water in those cisterns safer than the water in the wooden barrels of the besieging army below is still operating in the stone of that hillside, in the Norman Valley, right now. That physics is the same physics sitting in a glass pitcher on your shelf. What Chateau Gaillard's garrison had, you have. What kept fighting men alive through a winter siege under the army of the most powerful king in Europe costs $8.40 and requires a cool shelf in 12 hours. I don't know what brought you here. It doesn't matter. It works either way.